So today I'm going to talk about some of the interesting points from Chapter 7, Higher Order Cognition and Intelligence. Um, let's see. The point I found most interesting from the reading was having to do with Sternberg's triarchate theory. We discussed it. I know it was mentioned in the Chapter 2 unit because I remember in the infographic talking about the analytical and creative and practical intelligences, I believe. And the three components discussed in chapter 7 actually are a subtheory of analytical intelligence. Within that, it's the componential subtheory. So within that, you have performance components, knowledge acquisition components, and meta components. Performance components allow us to execute mental tasks, and they're how we complete tasks. The knowledge acquisition components are responsible for the intake and processes used in learning new information, and the meta components tell other components how and when to execute a task. As I said, this text reminded me of the infographic, so I went back and referenced it. And I actually had to do some of my own research to figure out that these were the componential subtheory of analytical intelligence. So performance, as I said, is the execution of mental tasks, and it allows us to make plans and decisions, and we use them to execute chores, like just normal tasks, normal and complex. But knowledge acquisition is responsible for, as I said, the intake and processes learned and learning new information. And the meta components monitor and control processing to make decisions, solve problems, create plans, and there are 10 meta components: problem finding, problem definition, selection of the set of necessary performance components, choice of the optimal strategy for the composition of these components, appropriate mental representation of the problem, attention deployment, monitoring of the problem-solving implementation, feedback reception, feedback processing, and practical implementation of feedback information. What I conceptualized about this is basically just, I feel like this chapter, a lot of the points had a lot to do with each other in the terms of, and I'll talk about it some more in just a second, but it was like so many of these things overlapped, whether it had to do with like deductive or inductive reasoning, or the complex versus simple tasks and processes and how we go about them, things like that. But this was most interesting to me because, like I said, I really enjoyed chapter 2, talking about the different intelligences and the approaches to problem solving and those things. The second point I found interesting involved the processual. Oh, excuse me, did I skip a slide? I did. Let's go back. Okay, it doesn't want me to go back. Okay, sorry. The second approach, or excuse me, the second topic I found interesting had to do with the processual and individual differences approaches to it's not all problem solving, but to the intake of intelligence, to learning, to intelligence. The researchers actually adopted or discovered two paradigms when studying problem solving. Again, the processual or individual differences approaches. The processual approach uses intuition, consensus, or comprehensive theoretical considerations to judge the structure of cognitive processes. And I conceptualize this as discovering an individual's raw cognitive abilities, excluding classical training and education. And the inductive reasoning included in this approach is also helpful as it functions from the bottom, the core, your base intelligence, up. Within this approach, inductive reasoning tasks, particularly analogies, are believed to be diagnostic of one's general cognitive competence. And I find this plausible, seeing as most of the more intelligent people I know are good with words and understanding comparisons. And the text describes analogical reasoning as using similarities to conclude something, typically from a specific observation, to create a broader assumption. An elementary example of this um, of of inductive reasoning is like, if my stomach hurts every time I eat a cookie, then I can probably assume that sugar makes your stomach hurt. Um, and then there's the individual differences approach, which concentrates on high versus low levels of cognition to characterize differences among people and their efficiency in solving complex problems. Used oftentimes, this is with deductive reasoning and syllogisms are often used a lot, and they're actually more of puzzles instead of tasks because they include a trap. Um, and when you create these conclusions based on broad assumptions and ignore smaller sources of information, a lot of times people don't always understand that that's what's going on. Um, and they most likely require that type of clarification. So that's why they consider those syllogisms on the IQ test within this approach to be more of a trap because they're puzzles, they're not really tasks. And then a third point I found interesting was involved cognitive strategies. These strategies involve the specific modes of dealing with a task or class of functions. And researchers observed if intelligent people preferred particular methods for the intake of information. Those classified with the analytical strategy, they pay adequate attention to detail early on and move through information successfully and are able to, as from what I understood, process things and get through the information efficiently and methodically. I think I fit the analytical strategy mold because I review information thoroughly. And but I mean, if I study a PowerPoint, I'm gonna pay a lot of attention to it in the beginning and go through, and I'm gonna lose interest as I work, but I'm still gonna go bit by bit. I'm not gonna look at the whole thing together. I want to make sure I understand as I go. The holistic strategy, these people blow through the information they're learning. They speed up it all as possible. They take all the information in and review it super quickly. And I guess it just depends on what works best for you. Um, as I said, I do more. I'm more analytically minded, and I just function better that way. But sometimes, if I just don't feel like doing something, I will use the holistic strategy. But I do function better and perform more to my abilities if I use more of the analytical strategy to intake new information. And then the last point that I found interesting had to do with the complexity of cognitive task and also the bottom up versus top down, which also involves the inductive versus deductive reasoning. And as I said, this chapter involves when everything kind of overlaps with this chapter. But the bottom up hypothesis uses inductive reasoning in simple tasks. Intelligence is a result rather than a cause. Because in my mind, if you start small and work out through something, people are probably going to be able to get through it, especially with the simpler tasks. So it may make you, when I read intelligence is probably a result rather than a cause, I see that as it's going to make you look smarter than you are. Otherwise, the top down is deductive, so larger to smaller. In complex task, intelligent is regarded to be a causal factor and is something general mental capacity that allows people to cope effectively with complex tasks. in my mind, this is showing more people with like genuine intelligence because they're able to, as it says, it's like it's a causal. So like you have to be smart to get through some of the more complex tasks. You know that if it's taking you more than an hour, you're having to put a lot of thought into it. It's not like they say like they consider a task simple if it takes less than a second. So I kind of struggled with this chapter a little bit, just not necessarily not being able to understand the concepts, but being able to create examples for myself of what these things look like. For instance, back at the like the different sub theory components, I had a hard time conceptualizing that because I felt like it was potentially like relative, and I'm more of a concrete thinker. I don't do well with relativity. So, coming up with an example that fit, like I could think of like, oh, what makes me able to complete a task or how I intake information and things like that. But I think it's definitely something that I want to study more and look more into. But I'm sure it'll come back up and these things will build on each other as the class this semester continues. So yeah, those are the four things that I found most interesting from this week. Thanks.